to the world of encryption. In this particular nugget, we're going to review encryption and why do we need encryption in our networks. We're going to start off with exactly what are we protecting. Just why do we need to encrypt our critical customer data to make sure nobody can see this type of data in the clear. And we're going to discuss exactly why do we need to protect this type of information. Then we will look at types of encryption that are supported inside the Checkpoint VPN1 suite. And we will review the actual process of encrypting that data. We'll review phase 1 of the encryption process, then we will look at phase 2 of the encryption process, and then we will close out this nugget with a discussion on certificate authorities. Now this is going to be key information to make sure you understand the concepts of encryption, which is going to be a building block into VPNs. This is one of the key areas you really need to focus on to make yourself successful for your CCSE certification, as well as that on-the-job knowledge that you're going to need as a network security professional. So let's sit back, take some great notes, and let's move on to the world of encryption. So let's discuss this encryption technology, and we're going to see exactly what it can do for us and why is it so important today. Well, we all know with the explosion of branch offices, home users, remote sites, different things that spin up, and the advances in cable and DSL and fiber technology today, we can find out that it's really easy to get a site online using one of these network means, either DSL or cable or fiber or whatever you have available in your area. But just because it's on the internet, we need to make sure that anything that passes between these two sites is going to be completely secure, and that's where a VPN is going to come in place, and that's where the world of encryption is going to help us. So let's take a look at some of the actual encryption mechanisms and the reasons why we need to encrypt our data. The main thing that we need to be aware of whenever we are sending data from one site to another, let's say for example we pull up this diagram that we're going to be building on in this particular series. We have our Nugget cluster server, which is our center of our mesh information. When this is basically where our corporate office is, as we stated before, and our remote office is Nugget Firewall B. Now, let's say this link right here is going to be DSL or cable or fiber or what have you. Any information that goes between these two sites, we need to make sure that it's encrypted, just in case an actual hacker or someone looking in the middle right here is looking to perform a man-in-the-middle attack, which means they're basically going to look at this traffic as it crosses the internet, looking for information sent in the clear that they can easily gather and then use that information for their own maybe criminal needs, such as identity theft or any types of exploits toward a company. They may use this as a data mining process to gather information before launching a much larger and much more vicious attack against a company. And that's why we need to understand exactly what we're going to be doing with encryption inside of our networks. Now, so what is encryption? Encryption is basically the process of us taking clear text and then combining it with an encryption software and making what's called ciphertext. Now the ciphertext at that point is sent, and the only two parties that can actually view that information is someone behind the Nugget Firewall B and someone behind the Nugget cluster. As it passes through each one of these firewall nodes, it's actually going to decrypt the packets, as we'll see, and it's going to remove the encryption mechanism from the packets and return the traffic to the clear so it can be viewed by a server on either side of these firewalls. Now with Checkpoint VPN1, we're going to support three basic encryption technologies. The first being symmetric and asymmetric encryption, and we're going to get into a definition of each one of these. We're going to look at Diffie-Hellman key management system, and we're going to look at digital signatures. So what is it about symmetric encryption, and what do we need to know about symmetric encryption? And as it sounds, symmetric encryption is basically when we use the same key to encrypt the data and the same key to decrypt the data. Now, the main points that we need to understand that symmetric encryption is good, but there are some disadvantages. And one of the main disadvantages about symmetric encryption is that anyone who steals the key, the encryption key, can actually steal all the data, because we're using the same key to encrypt that data and the same key to actually decrypt the data. So that's one of the main things why symmetric encryption isn't going to be a great technology for us to use in this type of setup. Now, the other thing that we have to be aware of whenever you're using any kind of symmetric encryption mechanism, we need to understand that you need to also deliver the keys in this type of information through some kind of secure means. So let's expand on that and take a look at exactly what we are diving into and what we mean by this. So let's open up this Nugget mesh here, which we're going to be using as part of the discussion in the VPN process in this series, and we'll get into building these VPNs as we move on through the series. Now, what we can see here is we have participating gateways. We have these two particular firewalls that we manage, and we have a mechanism that they will be communicating by. Now, each one of these firewalls, being as if we manage both of them, they're going to use certificate-based authentication to control the actual communication between them. If we go under advanced settings here in the Checkpoint software, we have an option right here for shared secret. And basically what we see here is use only shared secret for all external members. So let's say you're setting up a VPN with a partner company across an internet circuit. They give you the public IP address of their firewall, you give them the same, and then you guys are going to make a decision process on what we're going to use as far as the encryption mechanisms, which we're going to get into here in a few minutes. Now, the thing that we need to understand with using a symmetric encryption information or a shared secret type setup in this situation is we may be using the same key to encrypt and decrypt the data based on what we're using here for shared secret, but we need to understand that whenever we're transferring this type of information, we need to use some kind of mechanism that cannot be easily traced, maybe such as a phone call, a face-to-face meeting if possible, or even taking an actual shared secret, putting it on a USB key, and then overnighting that USB key to your partner company. Just the mechanisms to think about, and just to make sure that if we're going to use any kind of symmetric encryption, where we're going to use the same encryption key to encrypt and decrypt our data, that we think about that. Now, the next thing that we need to look at as far as encryption is concerned, there's an option where we are going to look at asymmetric encryption. So what is asymmetric encryption? It's basically saying that we're going to use one key to encrypt the data, and we're going to use another key to decrypt it. It's going to be much more secure than symmetric encryption, and it's definitely going to be a best practice as well. Now, there's a few things that we have to understand here. Asymmetric encryption is also called a public or private key encryption because the encryption scheme uses two keys. We'll have a private key and we'll have a public key. And these keys are going to be created using a process called Diffie-Hellman encryption, which we'll talk about also in a few minutes. Where basically the way it works is one gateway's public key and another gateway's private key create a shared secret key, and this shared secret key is used to verify and decrypt all of the encrypted packets. And because the different keys are used for encryption and decryption, they are called asymmetric keys. So that's just basically we're going to have one set of keys that'll encrypt and one set of keys that'll decrypt. So in this type of setup in our participating gateways, if we were using any type of asymmetric type encryption in this process, we would have these two keys here, and which is exactly what we're going to be doing between these two mechanisms. Between both these firewalls, we're going to be using an asymmetric encryption process. And where we can see this and really where it drives the point home, if we open up our Nugget cluster here, we can actually see if we go into our VPN information here, and we have an actual certificate that's built on top of this firewall. If we view this, we can see the information that's pertinent to our situation here. We can see that in this particular subject, we have a common name of Nugget dash cluster. We have our VPN certificates, and it tells us everything about this particular certificate that was generated from the internal certificate authority. Now, as part of this communication process, we're going to see it's also going to show us a MD5 fingerprint information, so we can do verification on our data, and we're going to see a SHA-1 fingerprint as part of this actual certificate information. Now, the point I want to make and why I want to show you this is that we have a different certificate per firewall. Even though all this is being generated by our certificate authority, which lives on Nugget management, each firewall is going to get its own certificate key whenever we build that particular firewall. So if we go into communication right here, we'll see the same type of information. And we can dig into VPN as well, do a view on Nugget Firewall B, and we're going to see that it has an encryption information as well. And we can see that it was also generated by the Nugget management server right here as the issuer. Now, whenever we create a VPN in a community like this, all of the actual communication as far as the asymmetric encryption mechanisms that we were talking about is all going to be handled by the community, and it's all based on the information that was issued by the internal certificate authority per firewall. So the main information I want you to understand about asymmetric encryption, we're going to use different keys for encrypting and a different key for decrypting. So let's talk about Diffie-Hellman. So what exactly is Diffie-Hellman, and let's take a look at that. So if we go under our advanced VPN properties here, we have the option here for use Diffie-Hellman group. So what is that? Basically we're going to have several groups here that we see for different powers. We have group 1, group 14, group 2, and a group 5. So let's go through and review some Diffie-Hellman information. Now, a Diffie-Hellman is going to be a public-private key pair, which is used for calculating a secret key, which is also used for encrypting and decrypting messages. And no secret information is communicated during the initial key exchange, so it does not require a secure channel. And this is what most VPN technologies are going to use as part of the phase 1 negotiation process here. We're going to use a Diffie-Hellman group that states that we can send out a public key to a partner company. They can do the same, and we're not going to be any less secure because of the information. We still hold the private key. We'll put our public key out there, and if someone gets a hold of the public key, no big deal. We're advertising it to them. So let's review a few more information about the Diffie-Hellman information. I want to explain exactly what each group is going to do for us as well, and we'll dive into that more now. Okay, so let's discuss the Diffie-Hellman groups a little more here. Now, as we can see, a group with more bits is going to ensure a key is harder to break, but it carries a heavy cost in performance, because before this initial communication in the phase 1 process, it's going to take a lot more if we have a much larger security group here. The default value that you're going to see is group 2, and that is 1024 bits as part of your IKE phase 1 process whenever you're negotiating a VPN tunnel. But we also have the other groups here. Group 1 is obviously going to be a little less secure because of its bit value, and we can see where group 5 is kind of going to be the middle of the road for us here, and the highest amount of encryption that we can have as part of the Diffie-Hellman group is going to be group 14, which is going to be 2048 bits. Now, this is all part of the initial IKE phase 1 process that we need to understand, and we're going to get into that and step through each one of these types of processes that are going to happen. But the main thing I want you to understand is that the Diffie-Hellman group is going to be used in that initial communication between two peer groups, and it's basically going to help us to ensure the integrity of our data, and we're going to make sure that no one's is able to actually modify that data as part of the initial IKE phase 1 process. So let's get into reviewing the steps that it's going to take for the phase 1 of our VPN process, and then we'll move into phase 2. So let's look at the steps to get phase 1 set up for a VPN process. If you're using Checkpoint or Cisco or Juniper, what have you, all VPNs in today's world are typically going to make this process where we're going to have a phase 1, an IKE process, and phase 2, an IPsec process that's going to occur. So what do we see here? In our particular setup, we're going to decide as part of the steps to phase 1, we're going to have an encryption process as the first thing we're going to look at. We're going to decide, are we going to use DES, triple DES, AES, or CAST as part of this first process of setting up the communication between our two parties. Now, the first thing we need to understand that each one of these values have a little bit different security parameter associated with them. Now, DES is basically stands for Data Encryption Standard, and DES is a symmetric key encryption method that uses a 56-bit key. And DES is going to allow interoperability with other IKE-compliant firewalls and provides one standard for encryption. So if you're setting up a typical firewall with a third party, DES is an option, but DES is a lot less secure, and it has been seen to be cracked. So most people these days will look to the higher encryption mechanisms such as triple DES, AES, or looking into a CAS type system as well. But main thing we need to understand about DES is it's the data encryption standard. It uses a 56-bit key, and it is a symmetric key encryption process. Now the next one we want to look at is triple DES. So what is triple DES all about? Triple DES is basically going to definitely address all the security concerns that were resulted from the DES process. Like I stated, DES wasn't very secure, and someone was eventually able to crack that encryption mechanism. So the thing with triple DES is triple DES encrypts under 3 different DES keys in succession, and it's equivalent to doubling the DES key length, and you're going to get 168 bits. So with triple DES, remember that it's going to be a lot more secure, and it's going to actually take care of any security concerns that were found out as part of the DES process, and it's going to be 168 bits that are part of the actual triple DES encryption key process. Now the next one we want to look at is kind of the standard for high security areas. Your government facilities or anyone who's really concerned about security is going to use AES. So what is AES? AES is the Advanced Encryption Standard, and basically it's what's used in the Federal Information Processing Standard for today for any kind of government documents or anything that needs to be transferred or secured is going to use an AES encryption mechanism. Now the main thing that we need to understand is that AES is definitely going to be a widely used encryption mechanism, and we're going to have a couple key length values that are available with AES. We're going to have a 128 and a 256 bit that are going to be supported. And as we know from our discussion on Diffie-Hellman, the more bits that we're going to have available in this encryption mechanism, the much more secure as it's going to be. Pretty much as we can see, the higher standards of AES are going to use AES with 256 bit as its encryption string, and that's going to be pretty secure, and up to this point has not been cracked or actually, even close to the process, because the actual computing power needed to crack an AES 256 encryption key would take you some time. You would have to compute that type of information for many years to get something close, and you still may not succeed in cracking this type of encryption mechanism. And the last one we want to talk about is a CAST. So what is CAST? A CAST cipher is similar to DES, but the things we need to understand is while the VPN1 implementation of CAST is going to use a 40-bit key length, the CAST algorithm supports variable key lengths anywhere from 40 up to 128 bits. And CAST is going to have a 64-bit block size, which is basically the same as DES. And even though a CAST has been found to be twice as fast as a typical implementation of DES and 6 times faster than triple DES implementation, a cache is not strong as DES using comparable key links. So even though DES was actually cracked and it's not comparable where it only uses a 56-bit key length, CAS kind of plays off of that type of encryption mechanism, and you really won't find it used a lot in today's networks. You'll see more often than not triple DES and AES as the encryption standards that most people are going to use. But I wanted you to be aware of it, and I wanted you to hear a few facts about each one of these type of encryption mechanisms. So, now that we have that out of the way, the next thing that we need to decide in our actual process of setting up our phase 1 of our VPN is the actual hash values. Are we going to use MD5 or a SHA-1 process? So, what we're going to look at is exactly based on jumping back over to this process on our IKE phase 1. We can see if we go into our VPN properties, our IKE phase 1 properties, we're going to perform the exchange of our actual encryption key. In this case, I have it set up to be AES 256, and we're going to perform the data integrity on this particular community using MD5. Now, MD5 and SHA-1, those are all common data integrity type technologies, and basically, you just need to understand this is the way that the VPN1 process, as part of the IKE phase 1, is going to ensure that data integrity is going to occur. Now, these are common encryption information, and if you want to pull up more information about MD5 and SHA-1, you're welcome to do so. SHA-1 is going to be the more secure process that we could take here, but let's look at that and we'll continue on from there. So I went ahead and looked up these values for MD5 and SHA-1, and I wanted to present those facts to you. Now, MD5 is going to use a 128-bit hash value, and you can read more about that in RFC standard 1321. And SHA-1 is actually going to use a 160-bit hash value. So the option of SHA-1 being more secure is going to be correct. And to actually have the most security, what you would want to do is an AES 256 with the SHA-1 on both phases of IKE phase 1 as well as your IPsec in the phase 2 process, and you really can't get much more secure than what you would have there. But I wanted to show you those options so you would be aware of them, and for now we're going to put ours to AES 256 and MD5. So what we want to look at now, the next part of this process is the actual authentication method. So as part of our authentication method, we have a couple choices here. Now, we can either authenticate our VPN gateways based on certificates or a shared secret. Now, we have shared actual certificates between our Nugget cluster and our Nugget Firewall B based on the internal certificate authority from Nugget Management. And as we can see, if we open up each one of these particular firewalls and we click on VPN and we take a look at the certificate again, we can see the information that's available directly on this particular firewall as issued by the internal certificate authority that's on Nugget Management. So the authentication process for these two in a community that we're going to manage is going to use certificate-based authentication. Now, if we're setting up a VPN with a third-party vendor, it may be very common that you're going to use a shared secret, and as part of that process, we'll obtain a shared secret from that partner. You'll give them one, they'll give you one back, and you guys will basically have to come into agreement on what are you going to use for your shared secret process. Now, as stated, we're also going to take a look at this as part of our actual certificate-based VPN that's going to come up in another nugget in this particular series. But if we open up the actual community and we go under advanced settings, and again under shared secret here, this is where we would implement that information should we need to set up a third-party VPN or set up a VPN with a firewall that's not being managed by the same Smart Center server, for example. So That's what we have, and I just wanted you to see that information so we understand exactly what we're doing with the authentication method. It's part of phase 1 to establish our IKE information. And the last part that we're going to look at is the actual Diffie-Hellman group. Now, as part of that negotiation we've talked about, during the initial IKE process, it's going to need to make a decision as part of that IKE packets that go outbound, which Diffie-Hellman group we're going to use. So if we open this up and we go under our advanced settings again, under advanced properties, and as stated, we have 1024, or group 2 is the default value, and we're going to keep that for now. And we would have more security based on the higher of the groupings if we were using group 5 or group 14. But for now, we're going to use group 2, which is 1024 bits. So that's the main structure behind the actual IKE or phase 1 process that's going to take place in most internet key exchange VPN type setups. One other thing we're going to see here is we're going to negotiate this particular IKE Security Association every 1440 minutes by default. So what we're going to see is that is our end goal, is that we need to get a security association set up. Now we see an option right here for aggressive mode. So what is aggressive mode all about? Well, a typical IKE phase 1 process is going to use aggressive mode, which is the default value for a lot of third-party VPNs such as Cisco or Juniper or anyone else who implements an IKE type of VPN will use aggressive mode, which is going to use the standard 3-packet process to take care of the IKE phase 1 process. Now, Checkpoint VPNs are going to use a process called main mode. Now, main mode is going to use a 6-packet exchange between VPN 1 gateways in order to set up the actual VPN. So the main difference to understand is aggressive mode, 3 packets. Main mode is going to be a 6-packet exchange, and it's typically going to take place between checkpoint firewalls when negotiating a VPN. So I just wanted you to see that information, and we'll move on from there. And now we're going to get into reviewing IKE Phase 2 as part of our actual process of getting our VPN established. So we should be good for now, and let's move into IKE Phase 2. The steps to establish Phase 2 are going to be a little bit less than what we saw in IKE Phase 1, which required a 4-step process to get the security association in place. In this one, we're going to review an IPsec protocol, which is going to be responsible for delivering our data across our VPN connection. And then we're going to look at the process of hash, where we saw earlier where we're actually going to use the hash value for guaranteeing our actual integrity of our data, and we have the option of using MD5 or SHA-1. So as we saw in our first initial setup on IKE Phase 1, we went through our 4-step process to establish a security association. But in Phase 2, the actual security association that's negotiated in Phase 1 is used by the peers to negotiate another security association for encrypting the IPsec traffic. Now, keys can be modified as often as required during the connection's lifetime by reperforming Phase 2. Now, Phase 2 provides additional protection by refreshing the keys to ensure the reliability of our actual security association and to prevent people from performing an attack such as a man-in-the-middle attack. Now, what we need to understand is as we look at our IPsec Phase 2 here, we can see that we're going to definitely renegotiate the actual IPsec Security Association by default every 3600 seconds, which is about an hour. Now, and that's typical in most IPsec VPNs, that's a default value. So I really don't see an actual reason to change that by default in most of the setups I have completed. But the option is there if you need to update the actual Phase 2 or IPsec rekey time for that security association. Now, what we have to understand as part of the actual process, IPsec is made up of a few protocols that ensure that it works the way we want it to. The first one is actually the ESP protocol. So what is the ESP protocol all about? The ESP protocol is actually the encapsulated standard protocol. So, or encapsulating security payload, I should say, are the two main parts. And the next one is the actual authentication header, which is going to be responsible for ensuring that we maintain the integrity of our data. So we have the ESP, which is our encapsulating security payload. So what this is actually going to do, it's going to encapsulate all of our data that we're trying to send out into an encrypted packet. And we'll see that as we jump into our actual VPN configurations, where we're going to encrypt our data. It's going to go to the next gateway, and the gateway is going to decrypt the data, stripping off all of the IPsec information as far as the ESP and the AH, which is the actual authentication header. And then we have the ESP plus AHA, which is also part of the suite that makes up IPsec to make up the whole encapsulation process as part of the authentication process as well. So IPsec is initially made up of all these different protocols that allow it to package all your data together. Similar to mailing an envelope is a good analogy that I've heard quite a bit from some people. Once you write your letter and you put it inside that envelope, that's essentially what IPsec is going to do. It's going to encapsulate the contents of your letter inside of that envelope, and whenever you take that and send it out to the mail service, they're going to deliver that to your destination. And that's the same thing that we're doing whenever we're negotiating our internal data. We're encapsulating and encrypting that data, and then we're going to deliver it to another site, whether that be one of our branch offices or a third-party site, and it's going to open the letter or decrypt the data so it can be seen by someone on the other side of the VPN tunnel. So that's the main process that we need to understand, that the IPsec process is going to essentially encapsulate our data. It's going to form a security association based on the information that was negotiated in our phase 1 process, where that security association was to occur. And we also need to understand that when we have two computers that are in agreement, two security associations are established. We have one for inbound communication and one for outbound communication. Now we're going to see this as we dive into some advanced VPN techniques throughout this series, where I'm going to show you how to use the actual VPN tunnel utility to go in and actually be able to view security association information and be able to remove those or clear them out. And I just want you to understand the base information of that. We're going to form the two security associations, and later on in this series we're going to get into looking into some additional information when we're troubleshooting our VPN information. So what we do know for IKE Phase 2, we're going to use our IPsec protocol. We're going to use the technology that's there to encapsulate our data. We're going to also have to choose an actual hash value, as we can see, as part of our IPsec Phase 2 process that's typically going to happen here. Now we also see an option right here which is called perfect forward secrecy. Now this perfect forward secrecy is typically used in a lot of environments where you want to renegotiate that phase 2 information, but you want it to be a little bit more secure if you're concerned that somehow somebody can figure out what's going on with whenever the phase 2 keys are actually being renegotiated. Because in most environments the IKE phase 1 is going to stay static, and then ever so often you're going to need to come in and renegotiate phase 2 is typically what will happen every hour or so. We will go in and actually renegotiate this particular IPsec security association. Now you can use this option to get a little bit better security here, and then you could be able to control exactly what's going on there. But I want to give you a little bit more information on perfect forward secrecy, and let's take a look at that. So with perfect forward secrecy, let's review a little bit more information about that. So what we know in a typical VPN, perfect forward secrecy refers to the condition in which a compromise of a current session key or a long-term private key does not cause the compromise of an earlier key that was established, such as a phase 1 key. Now, with the Checkpoint VPN, we can meet these requirements with the PFS mode. When PFS mode is enabled, a fresh Diffie-Hellman key is generated during the IKE Phase 2 and the actual renewal of each key exchange. Because the actual Diffie-Hellman key is generated during the initial IKE Phase 1, no dependency exists between these keys and those produced in subsequent IKE Phase 1 negotiations. So the main thing to understand is, as we reviewed in the IKE Phase 1, that's typically where the first Diffie-Hellman key is going to be placed or going to be set up, and ever so often we're going to come in and redo our IKE Phase 2 negotiation. If you wanted some advanced security to make sure that if someone had your Phase 1 process, but you want to make sure that they don't see exactly what's going on with the Phase 2 process, you could turn on perfect forward secrecy, which is basically going to make it generate a new Diffie-Hellman group key each time it renegotiates Phase 2, and you can use the default of 1024 or the other values that we talked about earlier. So that's the main process that we need to understand when talking about our IKE Phase 2 process. And once we establish both of the security associations at that point, that gives us complete security. And making sure there's 3 things that we need to make sure that we are ensuring, and that is confidentiality in our data, which basically states that no other person than the intended parties can understand the communication. Integrity, which is basically stating that the sensitive data passed between our communication peers is unchanged, that no one was able to modify that information, and therefore we're ensuring the integrity using an MD5 or a SHA-1 hash, for example. And then we need to be able to ensure the authentication. Now, the authentication is basically going to state that we are making sure that we are only communicating with the intended parties using either a certificate or a shared secret to set up that authentication parameters. So that takes care of the base process of understanding of basically what we're doing in our encryption process. So let's take a look at actual certificate authorities, and we'll close out our nugget. So let's review what a certificate authority is all about. Well, a certificate authority is going to issue certificates to entities, users, or hosts that's going to allow them to identify themselves, and it's going to provide verifiable information about who they are. Now, a certificate might include distinguished name, public key, an IP address, and information about how long that actual certificate is valid. Typically, where you will see this is an SSL type communication. Whenever you're visiting public websites, for example, you can notice if you open up the little lock icon inside of your web browser, you can pull up information about the actual certificate that was issued to that particular website. And it does give you the verifiable information that allows you to see who actually signed that certificate. And where you would typically see this on websites, there are several third-party certificate authorities out there, with one of the biggest being VeriSign. And where you can see that, let's say for example, we'll pull up a banking website and let's take a look at the certificate information, and we can compare that to what we know should be in that certificate. So I'm on Wells Fargo's website here, and what we can see if we open up this little lock icon, we can see it's SSL secured 128-bit. But we can see the information that we're talking about, that it was issued to Wells Fargo, and it was issued by VeriSign, and it's valid from 6/4 of 09 to 6/5 of 2010. Now, if we go to the actual details, we can see some additional information about the actual public key. We can see that it's 1024 bits on the RSA key. Now, this information is going to allow the information to be encrypted between my web browser and this particular web server using this type of encryption. So that's the main thing that we need to understand about certificate authorities. They're basically going to be third-party references that allow us to identify ourselves on the internet in most cases. And that's where you would typically see a third-party website. Maybe you have an e-commerce site, or you need to be able to set up your VPNs in order to allow public access to maybe a website for an SSL type VPN, which we're going to look at with SSL Network Extender. You could issue a public certificate to that if you wanted to do so. But that's the main thing I wanted to share with you about the actual SSL option, or using certificates in general as part of a certificate authority. So in this nugget on encryption, we cover just what are we protecting. Why is it critical that we actually secure our company data? Now, this is pretty self-explanatory, but we need to understand that we don't want to be on the bad side of a data leakage or anything like that. So that's why it's really critical that we always use encryption whenever possible for any data that's leaving our networks. We also looked at the types of encryption that are supported as part of our VPN1 system, where we saw DES, triple DES, AES, and a CAS type system that are available. We looked at the steps that are involved in a phase 1 of encryption for a VPN in order to get that security association established. We spoke about the actual phase 2 process of setting up the IPsec information, where we're going to encapsulate all of our data inside of the encapsulated packet that's going to be delivered, just like the letter scenario, to the other gateway or another house, so they can open up that letter and be able to view the clear text data or decrypt it, for example. And then we looked at some brief information about certificate authorities, where we're basically stated that they are third-party entities that are going to give us the ability to give us verifiable information on just who people are on the internet when we're communicating with them. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.